security threat. From the forests of Bastar to the Red Corridor, it challenged the authority of the state. But today the narrative is shifting from insurgency to containment, from conflict zones to claims of closure. A new book, Naxal, Terror, Vanquished, authored by Tuhin Sinha, captures this entire journey. From the rise of left-wing extremism in Naxalbari to its steady decline across India. It looks at the turning points, the policy choices, the security operations, and the human cost behind one of the India's biggest, longest running conflicts. Joining me now is Tuhin. Tuhin, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me begin this conversation by asking you, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, Karthikeya, that's an interesting question. As we complete, as we will be observing 1 year of Operation Sindoor, we need to realize that barely 15 years ago or 17 years ago, between 2004 and 2009, India was afflicted by, dual terrorism. One from Pakistan-sponsored groups. On an average, there would be one major terror blast across the country every 40 days. But simultaneously, there was another form of terrorism brewing in the hinterlands, in the forests of Bastar, across, the 100 districts which had formed the so-called Red Corridor of CPI Maoist. So, in fact, in May 2010, 148 passengers of a train traveling from Kolkata to Mumbai were brutalized because of the sabotage of a railway track at Midnapur. And 7 weeks before that, 74 CRPF Jawans were ambushed and killed in Dantewada by the Naxals. Unfortunately, despite the magnitude of the menace, there was very little conversation, there was very little political willpower to go after Naxalism. So this generation, the younger generation, will probably not realize what India has gone through, the national security threat, both external and internal, which India has witnessed about 17 years ago. Today, when India is officially Naxal-free, or maybe barring one district where there are some sediments of those Naxal groups who again would be wiped out in the next couple of months, this generation needs to know the importance of political willpower, which Prime Minister Modi and Home Minister Amit Shah have displayed in eradicating this menace. And at the same time, since India is surging ahead with some very definite goals towards its Viksit Bharat, targets, I have analyzed the role of these 100 districts which were hitherto afflicted by the Naxal menace, and how these 100 districts, a majority of whom also, come under the aspirational districts program launched by Prime Minister Modi in 2018, how the economic mainstreaming of these districts from here will subsequently add to our potential GDP growth in the next 3 to 4 years.
Do you think that the romanticization of dissent against the state, and I'm not talking about authentic dissent, I'm not talking about authentic protest, dissent against the state also contributed to the brutalization of
absolutely.
Of the rural spaces. You thought something in university, and then you went to those rural spaces, and then it turned into something completely different because you brutalized the life, you brutalized people who never wanted to be part of it, and a lot of people came into the crossfire.
Well, absolutely. There is a section which deals with the potential threat from the urban Naxal mindset, which still exists. Maybe it's in a slightly dormant form today because of its limited scope today. But there is a very interesting chapter on Salwa Judum. Salwa Judum was a one of its kind people's movement launched against Naxal groups by tribals in Chhattisgarh. And very interestingly, that was initiated by the leader of opposition in Chhattisgarh Assembly, a senior Congress leader, Mahendra Karma. And subsequently, it was supported by the then Chief Minister of Chhattisgarh, a BJP Chief Minister, Dr. Raman Singh. So it was a rare experiment where both the local leadership of BJP and Congress were on the same page and who felt that this this rather innovative movement was required to break the backbone of the Naxal groups. And it was primarily led by tribals. Now, every movement has some, aberrations, has some exceptions to it. So, in the next 4 or 5 years, despite significant success of this movement, the UPA government at the center seemed to give in to the propaganda of vested groups, which wanted to paint it as a extrajudicial movement, of which wanted to completely decimate it. So in 2011, finally, the movement was struck down by Supreme Court. Nandini Sundar was the chief litigant against the movement. And Menaka Guruswamy, who fought the case against Salwa Judum, as you are aware today, has been promoted by TMC as its Rajya Sabha MP. The judge who passed the judgment against Salwa Judum, Sudarshan Reddy, was rewarded by Congress Party 14 years later when Congress Party made him the vice presidential candidate last year. So my limited point over here is that the urban Naxal mindset was supported by several, current opposition parties which were then in positions of power, which primarily included the Congress Party. And one very important difference between the way UPA saw the problem of Naxalism and between the way...
We'll come to that. Because, there are two important things. The chapter 5, I really found it very, very riveting because I understand the difference and I have been to places like Gadchiroli. And when you talk about zero tolerance towards terror, because that laid the foundation of the book. What I want to know from you is, since you said 10 initiatives of Home Minister Amit Shah, how do you sum up his initiative? I really don't want to get into that 10 initiative, but how do you sum up how Amit Shah made the difference?
No, I would say there were 10 important, points in this journey of Home Minister Amit Shah. My sense is that post the abrogation of Article 370, the confidence that we could go after, this government could go after, seemingly insurmountable problems was building up. So, in fact, when Article 370 was successfully abrogated, that gave the government the confidence that it could also go after Naxalism. Unfortunately, 6 months after the abrogation of Article 370, COVID pandemic set in, and for the next 2 years, many of the initiatives were put on hold. But around 2022 mid is when the Home Minister had decided that it is time to end the menace. So, the first important thing was to bring in a synergy between different intelligence groups and different security apparatuses which were going after the Naxals in different states. As you are aware, this problem extended up to more than 100 districts, in fact. And one very important turning point where things actually worsened happened in 2004. When two important splinter groups of Naxals, PWG, the People's War Group, and MCC, Maoist Communist Center, merged to form CPIM, which is CPI Maoist. Now, there's a difference between CPIM Maoist and CPIM Marxist. Many people confuse that. CPIM Marxist still, has been fighting elections and has been supposedly following the democratic process. But in terms of thought process, if you see D. Raja supporting the Naxals, there is very little difference in terms of mindset. So it required seamless coordination by the Home Minister across these 5 afflicted states to make sure that every state was on the same page, because not all states had a BJP government. But yes, towards the end, if you see, Telangana also showed the same determination, and in fact, the last few commanders or dreaded commanders of the Naxal movement were finally neutralized, or finally they surrendered in Telangana. So to bring the entire 5 states on the same page in terms of the security coordination, in terms of the strategy coordination, was the most humongous task which went into this whole process. Another important point was the need for rehabilitation, and a very, very, foolproof rehabilitation plan, because a terror ideology invariably does not die. We have seen that in the case of Simi. Simi was banned by the Vajpayee government in 2002. But subsequently, it either reinvented itself as Indian Mujahideen or as PFI. So it is very important. It was very important for the Home Minister to ensure that the rehabilitation plans were in place, and that is why simultaneously the developmental plans for some of the worst districts were put in place.
Okay, it's a very nicely, or I would say neatly written book. But what really intrigues me is that in last 20 years, because of the Islamic terrorism, people talk less about the Red Corridor. They fail to understand that this war was eating the Indian security apparatus from inside. And there were a lot of casualties. A lot of people died. There were areas where our forces couldn't go.
Absolutely.
And people had no
so
idea about it. It was not part of the conversation.
I last met you when, I did this book, the Modi's Northeast story. Now, for the Northeast, for letting Northeast remain backward, the Congress party had used a term, the tyranny of distance. Now, with the tribal heartlands, the problem was something similar. The previous Congress governments did not want to foray into the most impacted lands, the lands impacted by Naxal violence. So, in fact, why did Naxalism grow? That again is a very interesting question. It is because of the indoctrination, which succeeded only because the state at some point decided to abandon the developmental projects over there. So, in fact, there are villages in Bastar which have finally got electricity after 78 years.
Sometimes, when I see these photographs, Tuhin also, and I spoke with a lot of security officers, they say one thing, ideas don't die. Ideas don't die. And after rehabilitation, we have to be very careful that they don't relapse. So, what is your take on that?
That is precisely why we have a foolproof rehabilitation plans. In fact, in Chhattisgarh, there are Anna canteens which are being encouraged and which ex-Naxals are being encouraged to start. Bastar today has an annual Bastar Olympics where a significant percentage of the participants are ex-Naxals. Gadchiroli will have a modern one of the most modern steel plants in the next 3 to 4 years, and again a significant percentage of those employed will be ex-Naxals. So the entire developmental apparatus is in place to ensure they don't go back to the dark days of Naxalism. But like I said, this is something which we will have to constantly keep an eye on. Drawing our experience from the way Simi had metamorphosed into other terror groups.
IM
and PFI.
Yes,
subsequently.
But more than that, there is also Tuhin, there is also another very important and interesting aspect, and I would like you to address that. And that interesting aspect is that when we talk about Naxalites, we are talking about political constituency. Very few people talk about that. The shattering of Naxalites as a political constituency, don't you think went a long way in shattering Naxalites as military units? Because then they became irrelevant to any political formation for elections. Isn't that so?
Well, yes, to a large extent, the Congress has played this double game. The Congress has, consciously encouraged, you can call it soft separatism is something which has been encouraged by the Congress party throughout. See, there was a fundamental difference between the way UPA saw this problem and between the way we saw this problem. UPA, despite the fact that the maximum casualties happened between 2004 and 2014, refused to see it as an issue of terrorism. And why? Because many of the appointees in National Advisory Council of Sonia Gandhi had extremely pronounced Marxist leanings who had sympathies with these Naxals. So whether it was Aruna Roy, whether it was Harsh Mandar, whether it was Jean Dries, when you have such compromised Marxist individuals on the NAC, how can you expect a government to succeed with a zero tolerance approach towards Naxal terror?
Okay.
So in fact, at one point of time, Chidambaram had in fact made a statement on the floor of the House that from here we will go off and finish off Naxalism. But, barely months after that, we had some of the worst killings. And then, the government somehow did not show the same spine to go after the
And this is militants. When the entire Chhattisgarh leadership of the party
2013.
Yes, entire leadership.
So imagine Mahendra Karma was failed by the top leadership of the Congress party itself. Mahinder Karma died in 2013 after, the Salva Judum was struck down by the Supreme Court, and Congress accepted the judgment in a very cavalier way without bringing in an alternative.
Let me bring you to the book. The final assault. You say that the history has shown repeatedly whether in the Nepal, Peru or Philippines, the insurgencies often fought their hardest when they had the least left to lose. You think that current operations have done away with the entire top leadership?
Absolutely. In fact, the killing of Hidma in November was a very decisive point in our annihilation of the movement. Hidma was the man who was responsible for the Dantewada attack, where 74 CRPF Jawans were killed. He was the one responsible for the train, sabotage. So, and not just Hidma. In the last 2.5 years, 1,000 plus dreaded Naxal commanders have been killed. 4,000 have surrendered, and they are, somewhere in the process of rehabilitation, or they have been rehabilitated. So yes, I think it's a conclusive end to that movement. And, you have to
Are you
give it
saying
to Modi
conclusive
government.
end? Because, you also write early intellectual roots before the term existed, the post-1990 rights discourse in the shift to cities, and the writers and thinkers as Naxal narratives. I brought this point out in the book because no militancy, no armed struggle, no violent struggle exists without a thought ecosystem. Is
And
that
Dr. Binayak Sen was the brand ambassador of these people.
so? Do you think that has been taken care? That
Absolutely.
intellectual veneer.
Absolutely, the way Umar Khalid and Sharjeel Imam have been treated in the last 6 years is a lesson for all urban Naxals. Don't fantasize about balkanization. This country will remain the way it is. This country will only prosper and thrive. But the mentality of balkanization, the mentality of dreaming of Kashmir Azadi, the days when those would be normalized are long gone. So I think nationalism is something, a nationalist sentiment. In fact, if I may deviate slightly and come to the Bengal victory of BJP, if you ask me, one of the reasons for this massive victory is people's anger against illegal migration. People's anger against open threats and open intimidation threats being doled out by TMC leaders. The rejection of the Diamond Harbour model.
I don't think any interview can complete without that. All of them, all these ministers, they work under the rubric of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And Prime Minister Modi has talked extensively on the issue of tribals. We have the president who has a tribal background. She's a tribal herself. So, how do you think that the Prime Minister's own thought in terms of Viksit Bharat and eradication of Naxalism
In fact, there's a chapter in the book
and
Prime
development
Minister,
in those rural areas have all come together?
in fact, there's a chapter in the book Prime Minister Modi for Tribals. And in fact, because I come from a tribal area, Jamshedpur.
I've read the book. That is why I'm asking
Because
you.
I have written the book, in fact, a trilogy on India's tribal heroes. I can tell you, Prime Minister's outreach to the tribal community has been phenomenal. Whether it is cultural integration, there was a parallel freedom movement which was being carried out, which was being executed by our tribal leaders, which never made it to our history pages. Today, we recognize that thread from 1855, not even 1855, from 1783. Tilka Majhi was the first known tribal freedom fighter. In fact, even before that, 1765, Raghunath Mahato had led a small movement in Purulia district. So from then on till 1947, there was a parallel tribal freedom movement which never got recognized. Prime Minister Modi gave them that due. When it comes to developmental objectives, if you look at Nal Se Jal Karyakram, maximum number of beneficiaries are from the tribal community. Swachh Bharat program, again, a majority, a significant percentage of the beneficiaries are from the tribal community. So all of these, and yes, the aspirational districts program of 2018, when 119 districts were identified and they were constantly monitored on several parameters to ensure there was a significant GDP rise over the next few years. You can't come across a prime minister. There has hardly been, I don't think there has ever been a prime minister so concerned about the tribals and so concerned about the upliftment of backward sections of society. So what Prime Minister Modi has done, both in terms of cultural renaissance of tribals and, for the developmental goals of tribals is something extraordinary, is something phenomenal.
Thank you so much, Tuhin,
Thank you.
for being with
Thank
me
you. My pleasure.
and writing this fabulous book, The Naxal Terror Vanquished.
अर्जुन कुछ भी पढ़े मेमोरी में नहीं रहता।
take it, date not bites.
नो एडेड शुगर, प्रिजर्वेटिव के बिना डेट्स, बादाम, पिस्ता, काजू और शहद से तैयार किया गया लायन डेट्स नट बाइट्स।
Take it, lion date not bites.
मंडे आइएगा सब पेपर्स के साथ।